Good morning.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure to be with all of you today on this lovely summer day where I kind of just want to go outside and play a little. Our opening reading is actually a responsive reading in your gray hymnal, number 565. It's called Prophets. So I will read the regular text, and then if you will respond with the italicized. Always it is easier to pay homage to prophets than to heed the direction of their vision.
It is easier to lie to their saints than to learn the human quality of their.
It is easier to glorify the heroes of the race than to worship the wise is much easier than to profit by their wisdom. Grandchildren of those who stoned the prophet sometimes gather up the stones to build the prophet's monument.
Always it is easier to pay homage to prophets than to heed the direction of their vision.
Saying earlier that the cello is my favorite instrument because it truly sings. Thank you for that. What makes a prophet? Our responsive reading this morning speaks about how it is easier to pay homage to prophets than to heed the direction of their vision. But before we can even consider that point, there's a much more basic one that we need to address. How do we select the people that we think are worthy of our recognition? What have we decided makes a prophet? I'm suggesting that we start with a kind of resource that should be fairly explicit in their description of prophets: religious texts. Let's take a look at one of the more obvious options, someone that I assume many of us know either from childhood religion classes or Charlton Heston: Moses. What was the first obvious sign that he was a prophet? I imagine that for many people, the answer to that question might be something like the burning bush. In the story, we know that at the bush, Moses is singled out by God. He has an exchange with God who tells him that he is the person chosen to free the Hebrew people from their experience of slavery. Moses repeatedly expresses doubt that he's the right person for the job, but God assures him over and over again that he'll never be alone, and eventually Moses accepts his role, that he is the one chosen to confront Pharaoh and lead the Hebrew people out of Egypt. So that helps give me some idea of what makes a prophet, but I think I need to do a little bit more research. How about another key example from religion? Let's say the prophet Muhammad. His story might be a little less familiar to people in the US, but for people who identify as Muslim, about a quarter of the world's population, it's basically basic knowledge. What was it that made him a prophet? According to the story of the first Quranic revelation, Muhammad was also chosen by God. The way that story goes, he was meditating in a cave and then all of a sudden felt a squeezing sensation, as though an invisible presence was holding him in a crushing embrace. It was in that moment that Muhammad was told by the angel Gabriel to read. After Muhammad protested, saying that he couldn't do so, he was suddenly overcome with and spoke the words that became the first Quranic revelation. Still, after that encounter, he didn't think that he was a prophet. In fact, he thought he was losing his mind. But with the assurance of his wife Khadijah, he began his legacy as a prophet. Okay, so in both of these stories, there's the shared theme of being chosen for prophethood. More specifically, they seem to have been chosen by God. So if we look at the stories from this angle, we can argue that Moses and Muhammad were singled out as leaders without really having a say in the matter. They were even a little reluctant. So from this perspective, it's their being chosen that seems to be the most memorable evidence of their being prophets. But is that an accurate picture? Is that even true of all prophets? I'm going to try widening our stories and see what happens. Before Moses encountered God in the burning bush outside of Egypt, he first lived inside Egypt. He was the son of a Hebrew woman born during a time when the Pharaoh had commanded all the Hebrew boys to be drowned in the river. In this part of the story, we meet three people who are often overlooked: Moses' mother, his sister Miriam, and Pharaoh's daughter. Their roles in the story seem inconsequential. Two of them don't even get names. But against this backdrop, their actions are nothing short of heroic. Risking her own life, Moses' mother goes against the royal decree, and she conceals her son for 3 months. Eventually, she can no longer hide him, and she places him in a basket by the river. And you know what? My guess is she knew exactly what she was doing. She knew who was going to show up next. That's probably why her daughter, Moses' sister Miriam, watched from a distance to see what was happening to her baby brother. She was waiting to play her part in the plan. Because before much time passes, the Pharaoh's daughter comes to the river for a bath. She sees the basket, has it retrieved, and when she opens it, she realized what happened. Now, Pharaoh's daughter knows about her father's decree, but she also chooses to go against it. Aided by Miriam, she returns Moses to his mother to have him nursed and eventually adopts him as her own son so that he can grow up safely. So what we end up with is two courageous women among the oppressed in a society who risk their lives for justice, and a woman who uses her position of power to help them save an innocent life. Okay, what about the story of Muhammad then? Before he encountered the angel Gabriel in a cave, he was a merchant, married to the wealthy Khadijah. She belonged to a powerful tribe known as the Quraysh, and it was actually her that proposed to Muhammad. I think that's some pretty modern-day gender equality. Khadijah, she didn't have to attach herself to a poor merchant, but she chose to make that relationship happen. And when Muhammad came down from the cave on that fateful night, she didn't have to tell him that he had in fact encountered an angel. She chose to calm him down and believe his story. When Muhammad began to publicly share messages on economic justice and monotheism that angered the members of the wealthy and polytheistic Quraysh tribe that was Khadijah's own family, she didn't have to support him. But she chose to encourage his words rather than to tell him to stay silent. When they were ostracized from society to the point that their lives were threatened, Khadijah didn't even have to stay with Muhammad. But she chose to do so. Like the women who saved the infant Moses, she too risked her life for something that she knew was right, without being told to do so. Moses' mother, his sister Miriam, Pharaoh's daughter, and Khadijah, none of them had that moment where they were explicitly called or chosen. But all four of them had a moment when they made a choice. See, this is where I think I'm getting somewhere. If we look at the stories from this angle, we see choice once again enter the prophethood equation, but this time it's not from an external source. We could even argue that there wasn't a God character in their stories. By widening these stories, we uncover other prophets, people who weren't chosen to act, but who made a free and responsible choice to act. No divine being delivered instructions through a burning bush or an angel. I wish that happened. It would make my life a lot easier. They had to decide for themselves what was worth risking their lives to achieve. They were fierce, free-thinking women. And what their stories show us, the risks that they took on, it's that prophets are not the select few who are chosen among us. Prophets are the ones among us who make certain choices. Choices that few others realize they too can make. Now, I recognize that the stories of Moses and Muhammad may be a little bit too far removed from our own experiences. They are stories, after all, and we don't necessarily know whether any of what is described in them actually happened. So where else can we search for answers about what makes a prophet? Well, it turns out that our own Unitarian Universalist tradition has something to say about that. Among the 6 sources of our tradition, we claim to draw upon the words and deeds of prophetic men and women, which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. So great, we have a source that includes prophets, but it doesn't mention choices. So what can we glean from this source in figuring out what makes a prophet? Challenge. Prophets are people whose words and deeds challenge us. They don't say or do things that are easy or free of risk. They don't tell us to follow the normally or traditionally accepted course of action. In fact, they do just the opposite. In the words of Bernice Johnson Reagan, one of the founding members of Sweet Honey in the Rock, prophets lay down the world as it is, and they pursue a new way of being, knowing full well that doing so comes with a price. This idea fits nicely with another obvious source we can turn to in helping to define what makes a prophet: the dictionary. According to Merriam-Webster, a prophet in the religious sense is one who utters divinely inspired revelations. Okay, that sounds like our first story angle. But the next definition is a person gifted with more than ordinary spiritual or moral insights. Someone who sees beyond what others see, who lays down the world as it is, because they have a different understanding of what is happening around them. And that's not all. If we look at the Greek origins of the term, we see that it comes from the word prophetes, which can mean to speak out, to declare, to make known. So prophets don't just see things differently, they share what it is they see. Okay, I think I have it. What makes a prophet? Prophets teach new truths that challenge our understanding of reality, even if that understanding is popular and loved. They're willing to speak out what others might be afraid to admit and combat forms of oppression that others still deny or defend as law or justice. And they do so in spite of the isolation, the criticism, persecution, and even death that may follow. Like the women in our earlier stories, prophets aren't necessarily chosen. Prophets exemplify the difficult choices we have to make. They demonstrate how we must live if we hope to confront the powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. So if it's those difficult choices that make a prophet, what stories can we draw upon to challenge us today? There are some obvious answers to that question. Martin Luther King and Gandhi quickly come to mind. There's also Malala Yousafzai, a young education activist who survived an attempt on her life by religious extremists. Or Ida B. Wells, an anti-lynching advocate whose investigative journalism against Southern racism led to many threats on her life. In our own UU tradition, we have prophets who led movements for religious and social freedoms that we now experience. Women like Margaret Fuller and Olympia Brown. People like Theodore Parker, who risked his life to support abolition from the pulpit. Fannie Barrier Williams, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. They fought for the expansion of civil rights to women and people of color. And you might know the story of James Reeb, the UU minister who was killed in 1965 by white segregationists while he was marching in Selma for civil rights. We can also look to Clarence Skinner, a Universalist minister who was criticized for his pacifism during World War I. In his book, The Social Implications of Universalism, he celebrates that the prophets of our past gained for us the freedoms we enjoy today. He wrote, "The genius of universalism is liberty. Its fathers dared to challenge the olden tyrannies of ecclesiastical authority and interpret life in larger and more triumphant terms." But that daring, he acknowledges, it comes with a cost. Its prophets were stoned in the streets for their daring and ostracized by their contemporary complacent fellow religionists. Ultimately, he says, it was their willingness to fight the battles of religious and civil freedom that granted for us the unchallenged right to interpret the fundamentals of religion according to our conscience. But Skinner also writes to challenge us. The fight for freedom is never won. Inherited liberty is not liberty, but tradition. The liberties that those before us fought to achieve, they're already outdated concepts. The freedoms we were born into, they don't include everybody. In fact, some still exclude and even intentionally harm. Look at our alleged criminal justice system, which is little more than a collection of practices designed to dehumanize and imprison Black and brown men and women. Here in Pennsylvania, the state's budget practices and the growing school-to-prison pipeline, they show that criminal justice has become a for-profit endeavor, often at the expense of our children's education. Or voting laws that claim to fight voter fraud, but in actuality seek to silence the voices of minority, low-income, immigrant, and even young adult voters. Skinner's words, they're nearly a century old, but they capture a challenging truth that we now must engage if we are to live prophetically. He writes, each generation must win for itself the right to emancipate itself from its own tyrannies, which are ever unprecedented and peculiar. What we know as freedom actually contains new forms of tyranny, new masked oppressions and structural injustices that we have to find the courage to name and tear down. Just like the prophets that have come before us who have made the difficult choice to risk their comfort and safety in pursuit of a new way of being, we must now choose whether we will live prophetically or passively. We have the option to glorify the heroes of our human race by simply remembering them, or to give weight to their examples by making new and difficult choices of our own. If the prophets of our past were alive today, what choices do you think they would face? If we want to win an ever larger and more important liberty, what decisions must we now make? In times of moral crisis, moderation is a cop-out. Irshad Manji, the author of Allah, Liberty, and Love, wrote those words because she believes we can do better. She believes we have to do better. And after the events of this summer, her words fuel the growing fire in my spirit. We have been sinking deeper and deeper into a horrifying moral crisis, thanks to the overt operation of sinister forces. But it's now time that we stop hiding from a truth that stares us in the face and continues to violently claim lives. It's a truth that some of us know all too well, and perhaps on a personally painful level. It's a truth that the events of this summer, particularly in Ferguson, Missouri, they reflect the symbolic and microcosm examples of a larger social epidemic. The truth is that racism is still deeply embedded and rampantly active in our society. We know that 3 weeks ago, Michael Brown became yet another young man murdered simply because of the color of his skin. As though his life being violently taken away from him wasn't enough, the follow-up since has been horrifying. There have been irrelevant and misleading stories circulated about his activities prior to the shooting in an event to blame a victim for his own death. There have been moves by officials to cover up and then to justify the brutal way in which he was killed. These deliberately misleading efforts continue because there's a simple and undeniable truth beneath them. Michael Brown did not deserve to die. His last words with his hands up in the air were, "I don't have a gun, stop shooting." But that didn't matter. The officer had already made up his mind about how their exchange was going to end. Our society taught him he could get away with it. Our society, with its Jim Crow-based mass incarceration system, its pop cultural portrayals of racial minorities as criminals, its biased reporting against black victims of violence as compared to white perpetrators, they taught Darren Wilson that black men had less of a right to live. Even before the two individuals crossed paths, Michael Brown's life was in danger, simply because he was a young black man living in a racially hierarchical America. And the angering reality is that Michael Brown is not the only recent example of this life-destroying truth that has occurred. Just a few days before he was killed, John Crawford, a black 22-year-old man, was shot and killed in an Ohio Walmart when officers thought a BB gun he purchased in the store that same day was a real gun. His last words, "It's not real." John Crawford is dead because he bought a BB gun. Yet somehow white open-carry activists are able to walk around family establishments like Target and Chipotle with real rifles striped to their backs, and nobody shoots to kill them. Before John Crawford, we even saw video of Eric Gardner being choked to death in broad daylight by police officers trained not to use a chokehold. They ignored his cries of, "I can't breathe." And these are just some of the stories that we have caught on camera. What happens when nobody is watching? So the truth is that there is a disturbing and sinister force at play here. And it's time that those of us with the power to say something make our voices heard and our presence known. We have to speak up. The individuals who have organized in Ferguson during these last 3 weeks in response to these deaths, they've highlighted just how far our society will go to deny the violent reality of systemic racism. People have been threatened, arrested, tear gassed, shot, and dehumanized by a militarized police force who claim to be keeping the peace. But how can there be peace when there is no justice for the lives of these murdered men? How can there be peace when the first instinct is to blame them for their deaths, to find some way to claim that they were a threat, and not the other way around? It may seem too awful to be true, but for the people whose lives are at risk the minute they walk out the door, it's a reality. In the words of James Baldwin, we have to look the grim facts in the face, because if we don't, we can never hope to change them. So this is the choice that faces us today. As other voices continue to deny that Michael Brown, John Crawford, Eric Gardner, or hundreds of other deaths this year had anything to do with the color of their skin, we now have a choice to be prophets, to name the difficult truth that racism has found new and more pervasive ways of operating in our world, that the law treats black and brown lives as having less value than white lives. We have a choice to live out the values that we proclaim to uphold by challenging the common narratives that serve to vilify and dehumanize people of color, whether they relate to criminal justice, immigration, education, or terrorism. Doing so involves great risk, not the least of which is acknowledging that we have all been party to institutional oppression, myself included. But we can't let those risks stop us from responding to Clarence Skinner's challenge, because those risks come with an amazing and essential payoff: justice. And because we know we can do better. We know that it is in our nature to love and to create, not to hate and destroy. We know in our minds and in our hearts that to let injustice stand, when we have the choice to confront the truth, sustaining its presence, that's an act that violates our innate sense of compassion. We know that real change is possible when there is the daring willingness to sacrifice the false safety of those masking lives we have believed about our world and its structures. If if we are to live into the values of equality, justice, compassion, dignity, and love that are essential to our Unitarian Universalist faith and inherent to all humankind, we must be willing to recognize this difficult truth. And if we are to succeed in our efforts to defeat structures of evil, we must be willing to engage a new understanding of the ways in which racism remains present today. We must be willing to name the forces we have allowed to unconsciously control and destroy our lives and social practices. And we must be willing to show the world that a new way is possible. The necessity to pursue this task is as clear as our fourth principle, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. This principle is often interpreted as supporting one's individual search, but today I ask you to remember that that's not all it includes. The free and responsible search for truth and meaning can't just serve us as individuals. It must move us as engaged and prophetic members of society. We cannot afford to ignore that this principle also means asking difficult questions about ourselves and our world. It cannot be a responsible search for truth if we have decided that some questions are too scary to ask, or that some problems are too big to solve, or some histories are too long to explore. And it's not a responsible search for meaning if we deny that there are explanations beyond the ones that are easy to defend. Because to uncover these truths is not enough. We must also be willing to risk sharing and defending them. In response to the events in Ferguson, one woman who self-identifies as white wrote about her grappling with this process as she raised her two blue-eyed, blonde-haired sons. She realized that she must teach them about the racism present in society and the privileges that come with simply having white skin. She realizes that she has to teach them about this truth because to ignore it means she risks letting them turn into people on the other side of the gun, the ones pulling the trigger. So there's one more element, I think, that makes a prophet. We know from our stories, the UU sources and dictionary definition, that prophets make the difficult decision to proclaim challenging truths. And they do so because, as other definitions suggest, they can predict the future. They prophesy about what's to come. And their words are grounded not just in outrage, but more importantly, in hope. Prophets speak difficult truths because they have a vision for something better to come. They have hope for a more just and peaceful world. They call attention to the tyrannies of our world because they know that we can do better. And they see that change, however tremendous and difficult it may be, it's the only way to reach that beautiful future. It's what moved Moses and Muhammad, Miriam and Khadijah. It's what sustained Martin Luther King and Ida B. Wells. It's what Irshad Manji knows when she writes, "All of us are chosen. A few of us recognize our choices and act upon them." The prophets that have come before us made the choice to speak and act upon difficult truths. They made the choice because they hoped and they knew that there was something better to come if they took that risk. And now it's our turn. I have just one more story about prophets for you. Last spring, I had the honor of teaching a group of youth the story of the Prophet Muhammad. In some versions of the story, it said that he was destined to be a prophet because he had a mark on his body, the mark of a prophet. One of the students in the class, Ellen, she asked me a reasonable question. What did it look like? I told her that I didn't know. In fact, none of the stories knew what it looked like. Then I asked her, well, what would be your mark? She thought for a moment, and then she said, a circle. That's interesting, I responded. Why a circle? She looked at me and she said, because it is finished, but never ends. She's 9. Racism should not be the pervasive and destructive force that it is in our world. But until we are willing to acknowledge its presence as deeply embedded in our institutions and social norms, we will never see an end to its violent effects. Unless we speak the truths that there are actions that we can no longer tolerate because we know we can do better, discrimination and injustice will always claim innocent lives. Those who came before us dared to challenge the tyrannies of their time, knowing that their actions carried a price. In the words of Clarence Skinner, once again, let us meet the issues of our time with intellectual frankness and with moral courage. Let us recognize the challenging facts of our day and answer them with truth and with reason. The prophethood of Moses, Muhammad, Miriam, and Khadijah, they may be finished, but the need for prophets never ends. The power to confront evil and injustice with love, compassion, and a universally liberating truth is one that we all possess. So let us learn to live prophetically, remembering that it doesn't matter if we are chosen. It matters that we recognize that we have a choice.